Hey guys, if you're shopping for knives and gear, make sure you check out the description of the video you're watching right now for a link to my Amazon store where I've compiled some of the very best items available, including some of my own personal recommendations. Thanks! What's going on, YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I've got kind of a discussion, kind of a ramble video on the topic, what's so great about flipper knives. Depending on who you are, you're probably going to get something different from this video. You know, if you already love flipper knives and you kind of understand exactly why you like them, you might just be nodding along, you know, and getting some affirmation on this video. If you don't like flipper knives, then you may not get anything from this video. And if you've never handled one, especially a manual flipper knife that's got a properly tuned detent, then maybe you'll get something out of this. But I've always found, you know, I love a lot of different deployment types, right? I'm really, I can be critical of knives and I can go into extreme detail, right? And I can point out when there are flaws with certain, you know, operational mechanisms, right? But for whatever reason, I just have this like irreversible attraction to a flipper knife, and I kind of dug deep into my mind and tried to figure out what it was, what the attraction was, and I think I've kind of got it. First off, I'd like to say thank you to all my generous patrons who are supporting me during this time. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, there is a link down in the description. You can get some of those stickers and some other cool stuff. Thank you so much. The origins of the flipper knife, right? I think, like, if you, depending on who you talk to, some people will say, like, oh, there's proof that flip knives have been around for however, blah, blah, blah. Quick Google search for anybody who wants to look it up. I think most people agree that in 1999, the release of the M16 through CRKT, the Kit Carson design, was the first actual flip knife. Now there's a lot of different versions, and I've got a whole bunch of different flipper knives laid out here, all different price ranges, a few different styles, some that are technically flipper knives, but have little things that a lot of people don't agree on is the best version. And we're not really going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples, but really what I want to talk about today is why this is so appealing. And I think I've got it nailed down. This weekend, we're going to be talking a lot about flipper knives in general. But I do, just to let everybody know, I do appreciate different, you know, mechanisms of deployment, right? The thumb stud opener, of course. And sometimes it's not just about the deployment method, but what it is working with in terms of the relationship between the deployment mechanism and the lock, right? Which truthfully, I think has a lot to do with it. For whatever reason, a thumb stud opener in combination with an axis lock is very fidgety and fun, and a thumb hole opener in combination with a compression lock is also really fun. But I can't deny that there's something about flipping a knife that's got a great relationship between the flipper tab and the detent strength, right? That one's got a really strong detent, as you can see there. And then the movement here, disengaging, having that flipper tab fall on your fingernail and then watching it fall shut, or you shake it shut. For whatever reason with me, and I'm hoping that there are enough of you out there that agree with me that this video is valid, for whatever reason, that movement there is very, very appealing. Now, you know, a flipper tab is convenient in a number of ways, right? I mean, let's talk about some different types first. I mean, something that I'm going to exclude here, and this is going to frustrate a few people, is a knife that's got a flipper tab, but it is assisted. Yeah, it's a flipper knife, but the problem is that the satisfaction, basically the part of a flipper knife that I think is really attracting me, is being able to put my own force into the flipper and build up enough kinetic energy to break the detent ball and then fire the blade on my own. In this case, it's not so much what's happening. I'm basically just pushing down the flipper tab until the spring takes over, and that takes some of the satisfaction out of it for me, and I feel like it does for a lot of other people, which is why assisted flippers, I mean assisted knives in general, by, you know, a lot of people aren't really into them. That get into a lot of the higher end manual stuff, or even, you know, nowadays, like the manual budget stuff that's really, really good, right? But that's, I think, part of the reason why people just don't really like the assisted feature on a flipper knife, right? There's also top flippers or front flippers, whatever you want to call them. They're satisfying in their own way. They have their own fidget factor, but I think it's the general feeling of not having as much control. Now, the longer you play with stuff like this, right? This is an Olamic cutlery whippersnapper. The last one was a Kershaw dividend, by the way. The longer you play with stuff like this, the better you get. You'll adapt to it, right? And it's great. It's fun. Some people are going to like those more than flippers, but again, if you're like me, there's nothing quite like breaking that detent and firing it, right? There's nothing quite like that. In a pinch, when you're going to use the knife, I mean, truthfully, as long as the knife is designed well, and what I mean by that is the flipper tab is a shape that is welcome to the natural position of your index finger to either lay down and push button, which means essentially pushing down. Sorry, let me focus right here. Pushing down here and starting to build up force. And then as the force increases, eventually you break the detent and fire. The other method is, of course, light switch, which this flipper tab is kind of designed to accept either way, but basically just pulling down on the tab. Now, a combination of a reasonably strong detent and a smooth, surface for the bearings to ride on the inside of the pivot, and then, of course, weight and mass of blade, right? Those ratios determine exactly how well that blade deploys. If you don't push it exactly right, so let me see if I wonder if I've got an example. Here's an example of a flipper knife. The PMP Revenge is an awesome knife. Here's an example of a flipper tab that's not so, satisfying to flip, right? It's a little small, so if I want to push button it, it didn't come out all the way, right? If I want to light switch it, it came out all the way there, right? But it's kind of small. It's kind of difficult to engage. So this is the first part that really needs to be exactly right. I can still do it. You'll figure it out. But on a knife where that's figured out, right? Like on this Civivi Brigand, it's a great flipper. It's a budget knife, right? A lot of these I'll include links for down in the description so you guys can check them out. But this feels natural. I'm laying my finger down here. I can build up force. It breaks the detent, and then the blade is big enough and the detent is strong enough that it fires out. It's the initial break of the detent and then the click of the knife into place. There's generally two clicks. And it's the sound and the force that you're creating, I think, that draws me into them so much. Now, if the flipper tab is exactly right, or at least exactly right for your finger, right? Every knife is, there's no such thing as a perfectly shaped flipper knife, because it depends on, number one, what you consider, light, medium, or strong detent is going to be different for every single person. How your hands and your index finger lay organically on the flipper tab is going to be a little bit different. For example, this Off-Grid Scorpion is one of my favorite flipper knives of all time. Came out of nowhere. And it's got just an absolutely fantastic flipper design for my finger. It is so comfortable to put right here and then fire. But I can feel the breaking of the detent. It goes, that noise and that feeling, I can feel it every single time. And it's also the force, for whatever reason, that the blade actually fires from the handle. In some cases, you can actually control almost exactly how hard a knife flips depending on where you're putting your finger on the knife. For example, this CJRB Agave, if I light switch it back there, right, the moment that it breaks the detent, for the most part, is going to be about the same. You can kind of control the force, but if I come back here and start pushing really hard in the direction that I know is not the right direction to break the detent, and then slowly rock forward, that force, whatever force I'm applying, will then be applied to the blade, and you can kind of control how hard the blade fires out. That's not in every single case, but those of you who have sat around and fidgeted with your flipper knives for an enormous amount of time know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's something kind of satisfying about getting that blade to rock it out super hard. Don't know what I'm talking about? Well, let's talk about ProTech real quick and talk about what everybody loves about ProTech. That blade fires so hard. These things fire so hard. It's so satisfying, right? How hard the blade fires doesn't actually have to do with, it doesn't offer any sort of benefit in terms of utility. You could make an argument that, well, it's technically additional speed in a life or death situation, or, well, it needs that extra power to power through gunk that's on the inside of the pivot, right? So that it deploys when you really, really need it. You could, but most of the reason that people like a knife to fire hard is because it feels good. Come on, guys, let's be honest. It just feels good to fire a big knife. I actually unintentionally gave that one some risk. It didn't need it. It feels good to fire a big heavy blade, or not necessarily even a heavy blade, but just it feels good to fire that blade out. It's not just the feeling of breaking the detent right here, right? Now I can cause this to misfire here by putting my, I can cause this to misfire by putting my hand up here. Yeah, of course I can. But I think I can actually get that to misfire. Yeah, there we go. that breaking of the detent, right? You can feel the break, and then you subconsciously expect the impact of the tang of the blade on the stop pin. So you are physically anticipating it, you're physically feeling it, and you can hear it. For whatever reason, the combination of all those things, when the flipper tab is properly shaped for the design and your hands fit the design, they fall naturally into the position for the flipper tab. And then the oftentimes, if the blade is, you know, big enough and heavy enough to, you know, what am I trying to say here? Big enough and heavy enough to complement both the detent strength and flipper tab and the smoothness of the bearings, right? If all those things come together, what you end up with is this very difficult to describe. I'm doing my best job here, and we're 10 minutes and 30 seconds into the video, and the best way I can describe it is when all of those things line up, you get this sort of this explosive rocketing action of the blade. And whether some people care to admit it or not, you know, it's there. You feel it. You want proof? Hand off a really good flip. Here's a great example. This is a Holt Spectre V4. This is a flipper knife that is not a frame lock. Now, the problem with most flipper frame locks is that you can, you know, especially new people, they might accidentally, my dad does this every single time. He puts his fingers right on the titanium lock bar, and he puts unnecessary pressure there, which is pushing the detent ball into the detent hole, and it's making it harder for you to break that detent right there, right? So you have to kind of, you know, we adapt to it, right? Those of us who are used to flippers just know to, you know, keep your fingers off the lock bar. And so this is a great example. Whenever I hand this knife to somebody, it doesn't matter where they put their hands on this side because it's a liner lock. That's the V4, right? So that means that no matter how they approach this flipper tab, right? This is approaching the flipper tab right here. This is what that looks like. No matter how they approach it, it doesn't really matter. Their finger's going to find this area, and they're going to, oh, it's a lever, and they're going to pull down on it, and it's going to fire. And every single time, it doesn't matter who, knife guys, non-knife guys, or gals, it doesn't matter. They all go, ooh. Sometimes it's a little bit of a fear thing, and sometimes it's like a, you know, I don't want to say obligatory. It's a natural reaction to a satisfaction for something they didn't know that they had, right? Try it. I mean, you know, initially, I think the draw to assisted knives is that you get that feeling without really trying. But what Holt has done here with the Spectre V4 just proves that, you know, the assisted feature, I mean, truthfully, the assisted feature on at least a flipper knife is rendered obsolete by designs like this. When the detent is tuned so perfectly that there's no way to break it without fully deploying the blade, right? It just takes a certain amount of force. Once it's broken, it goes. And then you can put your hands anywhere. You don't need the assist because the knife is going to do it for you, right? So at least in the V4, it kind of takes away from any rational necessity for there to be a spring in there. But yeah, that's going to yield this sort of physical and emotional reaction to it because the blade sort of, you know, flies open a lot like a switchblade, right? And for whatever we associate that sudden and rapid deployment of a blade with kind of a, you know, some people shy away from it and some people are drawn towards it. They're enthusiastic about it, but it is most of the time, 99% of the time, it is an emotional response, a physical and emotional response. I don't know exactly why because I mean, in both of these designs here, we have thumb stud and we have the thumb hole, left-handed reverse flick, by the way. Take a silent golf clap in the comment section for that. You know, in both situations, I am, again, breaking the detent. And for whatever reason, it's not quite as satisfying. Now, I'm not saying that the flipper is better or more utilitarian necessarily than either of those deployment mechanisms or any other mechanism. In fact, I've got a versus video coming on Sunday where I'm going to discuss just that, flipper versus thumb stud versus thumb hole. But for whatever reason, it's more satisfying. And when it is properly done, you can depend on it. And it becomes it does become a really great thing. Let me use the Praxis as an example. This knife has a lot good going for it. Not just the design, the blade shape, right? Or the fact that it's got a flipper tab, right? it's actually the combination of all things. It's inexpensive, it's ergonomic, the blade is ground in a way that's performance oriented, and it flips well, and it flips reliably because all of these design features are in place and beneficial, right? So this becomes an object that, when pulled from the pocket, in my opinion, is not only dependable, but it's satisfying each and every time. It's just barely registered. You can see here that I've been using this quite a bit, and I do. I use this knife as a tool, and I enjoy it. But here's the thing. The difference between this knife and the Rat for me, because these both get used, right? They're both about the same length. They're both utilizing D2 steel. They've both got good ergonomics, similar materials. One's nylon, one's G10, right? But the difference is that the deployment method here, I mean, I still do the actual thumb flick, but I feel nothing for this anymore, right? Now, that's not to say that I don't love my thumb flick knives or my thumb stud knives, in a fidgety sense. It's just that the only thing for a while that this knife really, gave, that there was any joy, the only thing separating it from this, thing that I loved and this tool that I didn't care about was the fact that, oh, it's got a decent, deployment here. And then eventually I got over that, and now it's literally just a tool. I appreciate it for being a tool, but there's not like this, this subconscious feeling of like, oh, that was satisfying. It's not there anymore. With this knife, again, this is a tool, right? I could care less anymore about the colors of the liners or anything like that. I'm going to get it out when I need it. But, my hand going to my pocket, pulling the blade from my pocket and going to deploy it, there's nothing going on in my subconscious that's basically connecting my active thinking with what my hand is doing until this moment right here. And then I go, oh yeah, just a little teeny tiny part of my brain is like, bam, and it feels good. I don't know why, but I'm like that with flippers. Now here's the other thing. It's like every other knife that comes out. I mean, here's my proof that, even if you're not a big fan of flipper knives, the proof, it's not like it takes a whole, I'm going to prove that people like flipper knives. Of course people do, right? But the biggest the biggest neon sign is the fact that like every other knife that comes out in today's knife world is a titanium frame lock flipper on bearings, because it has this sort of, it's got fidget factor that I think is easier to figure out than any other knife. I'm saying that like while I failed that first flip, my finger fell off I always forget that the Shirogorov is literally in between a light switch and a push button. It's like a diagonal flip. It's perfectly tuned, but you have to remember, from transitioning from something like the Hinder XM18 that's hooked upwards to something like the Shirogorov that's actually hooked downwards and has a different angle for breaking the detent, right? My fingers are a little bit confused. Every other knife that comes out is a titanium frame lock flipper, because the fidget factor, to somebody who is new or transitioning from a previous tier in the knife world up to a manual flipper, right? It used to be up to, now manual flippers are like all over the place in different price ranges. It's the easiest for, I think, people to pick these up and go, oh yeah, I get it. Right? Because people figure this out. Here's the movement, right? Pull from pocket. This usually lines right up against the palm. Lay your finger down, flip, then you move. You generally turn the knife in towards your palm. You put your thumb here. If there's a reasonable cutout right there, it's easy to engage. You engage, moving the lock bar out of the way, and then this index finger pushes the blade back and rests that flipper tab on your thumbnail so that, it keeps the blade from coming down on your finger. At the same time, if it's a good design, the detent ball that's on the frame lock has now run up on the face of the blade rather than sitting in front of it. That's what I describe as double clutch, in a situation where if the flipper tab were resting against my thumb right here, well, that's where the detent ball needs to run up on the face of the blade. Now, oftentimes, certain designs, if they're limited by the design, they solve that problem by creating a detent ramp so that it's not in that position no matter what. The detent ball rides smoothly up onto the surface of the blade, so that you don't put yourself in that situation. But in a design like this, right, the flipper tab stops it from coming down, and then you have a moment to move your thumb out of the way, and then you can kick that blade back into place. And so we sit on our couch and we do this over and over and over again. And all the relationship between all of these properties that I'm talking about in the off-grid Scorpion is absolutely perfect, and that's why I love that. It's like that in a lot of different designs, though, and it's on purpose. It's not like they just accidentally got that. It's, these companies know. right? They know that this is what people want. Some people like to do this. They like to do the shake shut thing, right? And some people like to do that thing where they kick the blade back down, right? A lot of these designs, whether they're liner locks or titanium frame locks, they have the exact same idea. You can do that. And once you've done it a couple of times, you figure the knife out, right? You can do that on just about anything. But that's what's fun about them. It is a reliable system. It is a system that is associated with a lot of super high-end knives. It has fidget factor, and at the same time, it is very utilitarian, and it is a fast system. But, you know, truthfully, between assisted knives, flipper, thumb stud, thumb hole, whatever, I've never seen an assisted thumb hole knife, but I'm sure there's one out there. Or manual thumb stud, manual thumb hole, manual flipper, top flipper, automatic knife, OTF knife, you name it. They're all about just as fast. You know, I'm sure there's at least one person out there going, flipper knives are the fastest one. No, they're not. They're all the same, except for the Emerson Wave knives. Those technically deploy faster than anything else because it's deployed before you've even got it slightly past your pocket. But that doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about, right? I know you guys want me to flip all these out. But I think in particular, you know, whether or not the knife is utilitarian or functional in terms of the satisfaction of deployment, I think is trivial when we're talking, you know, specifically about the satisfaction of the flip. Doesn't necessarily have to be a big knife, but when the weight and mass of the blade is, you know, large enough to carry that mass into the stop pin and create recoil. The Hinder XM18 is a fine example of that, and it is, you know, up until now I didn't realize it was part of one of the major reasons why I liked it so much. Because truthfully, no, the flipper tab's not shaped very well, and the jimping down here is kind of a hard landing zone. But once you do break the detent, the XM18, you're hearing the sound of the detent ball breaking away from the detent hole in the blade. Then you're also hearing a secondary click here, the audible detent ball passing over the edge of the face of the blade and the actual stop, which creates a lot of noise because of the external stop. So in the case of the XM18, not only do you have a really heavy detent and not the best shaped flipper tab, but a good relationship between flipper tab, pivot, and massive blade, you've got the heavy detent and the large mass being carried out into the stop area back here, the frame. Part of the reason I think why people like XM18 flippers so much, or maybe even XM18s in general, is the interesting sound that they make when they flip. It's like a... There's three noises. If I slow everything down, I've done this in slow motion before, there are actually 3 different clicks, but it's very noisy. And there's a distinct... And the second, it has actually 2 different noises in it. And it's very audible, right? And it sounds exactly like it feels. I think that's the key there. When a knife sounds exactly the way that you assume it's going to sound and then feels exactly the way that you assume it's going to feel, or even surprises you a little bit with some extra recoil, I think that's what draws people into flippers. Is that what makes a good flipper? No, because the whole design has to... I mean, truthfully, it's more important that it's a good tool than it is a good flipper. But oftentimes, you know, those things are all synonymous with each other, right? Because it's part of it. The deployment should not just be powerful and make you feel good. It should also be convenient, smooth, and operational, right? So that's the thing. Tucson TS 220, what is this? The 223, the Zeba Knives S3 Mini. I always forget about that one. Civivi Praxis. We've got the Steelcraft Series 3/4 Quaken, PMP Revenge, Off-Grid Viper, which is a nice semi-budget knife. We've got the Civivi Brigand, the CJRB Agave. We've got the Tape Designs Hornet, which I don't know is available in that format anymore. Maybe it is. Kershaw Natrix in copper, Kershaw XL Sheepdog, Holt Spectre V4, Shirogorov F95 Special Edition. I'm sure you guys are wondering about this knife. This is a unique one. This is a button lock flipper, but it is not the standard ProTech Mordax. No, this is actually a special titanium edition. There's very few of them that are made. So it's satisfying for a multitude of different reasons, but the same sort of reason that a flipper is generally satisfying, right? It's because it flips, and it flips in a powerful way that feels good. And then, of course, the Off-Grid Scorpion. Guys, I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I can say here. I've been rambling for 24 minutes now, and I feel like I've covered at least my thoughts on why I am so attracted to flipper knives, but, you know, everybody's different. I hope at the very least you got something out of this or were entertained by it, or at least got to look at some knives that, you know, were fun to look at. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Remember, a lot of these will be down in the description where you can pick them up. If you'd like to check out my other content, I do, of course, have lots of videos of knives that are either expensive or inexpensive that I do or don't like, so check those out. And if you enjoy all my content, go ahead and click on that Metal Complex logo right there and subscribe, because there's definitely more coming. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a great day.